Welcome back to the third and final week of the Cotton Drifting Festival series. I know this one is being released a considerable bit away from the original anticipated airtime, but that is because I was told Umineko's 8th episode would actually be important for this video, so I decided to go ahead and completely finish it. Which, by the way, Umineko is now easily one of my all-time favorite things probably ever. I really loved everything about it. Really quickly though, if you haven't read up to episode 8 of Umineko, please don't watch this video. I'll be talking about stuff that happens throughout all of the series, and it's really good. I really recommend you go and experience it for yourself. But anyways, it's time for the big question of this video. Are Umineko and Higurashi connected? Well, sorta. This question has actually been a really hard one to answer, but I do think that all of the references between Umineko and Higurashi so far have just been that. References. There are some that can be furthered to connections, but any kind of serious implications are left both ambiguous and up to interpretation of the readers. The two stories are extremely different and likely don't really connect at all for all we know, and I highly doubt we will ever get outright connections between the two that are very obvious and in the open. This video will be discussing all of the known connections and references we have between Higurashi and Umineko, and what could possibly come from Sotsu. However, only the connections and references that matter. There have been a fair amount of mentions of Higurashi and Umineko and Umineko and Higurashi, but only a few of them actually really mean anything. I do have something I would like to discuss after the connections though, so please stick around for that. Firstly, I want to make it clear that yes, there might be some connections from Umineko and Sotsu that happen, but they will likely be ambiguous or not obvious. We're not going to see Lambdadelta prancing onto the stage. We're probably never going to see Rika turn into Burn. Stuff like that is going to be left hidden. Ryu has never been the one to really confirm answers for stuff like the witches and doing anything more than references, so any slight mentions could ruin a lot of the ambiguity of Umineko. With that out of the way though, let's get to some of the references and connections. On a faithful and stormy night, likely in the 1960s or the 1970s, Takano Mio challenged gods to strike her down, but if she lived, then to give her the power to become a god. Lightning strikes down, and miraculously it does not hit her and she lives. We learn through Umineko in episode 8 and Lambdadelta's diary that none other than the Witch of Certainty herself chose Takano to live here and bestowed upon her the power to certainly become a god. It is implied in Umineko several times that Hanyu is the game master of Higurashi, with Rika being one of the players. From Burn talking about her childhood and claiming it was something her past self would do, and a lot of panels of Rika visually being used to show Burn's past. We even have Rika Furude, I probably said that wrong, I don't really care, who is a manifestation of Burn onto the game board. I don't think it's a coincidence that if you take the E in Erika and replace it with the O in Furude, that you get Rika Furude. We also know that Hanyu is likely the creator of Burn's logic error, and that Lamb was involved in it somehow. But the original Higurashi ends with no logic errors, with Takano losing and a seemingly happy ending. What gives? Well, I believe the end of the original Higurashi was the end of the first few games. We all know that Gou continues Higurashi, and Higurashi doesn't wrap up some open-ended questions, such as Hanyu's connections with Featherine, or Lambda's connections with both Satoko and Takano, as well as the creation of Burn. In fact, things seemed very stagnant, and it became very clear that there were some missing links for implications of the two series. That was until a certain scene in Satokowashi. When Satoko is at St. Lucia, she gets thrown into jail. She begins to plead and beg to the heavens to go back and change her actions, and this scene happens to have an extreme amount of parallels between the Takano scene from the original series. Begging to the heavens for a change, there being a thunderstorm going on outside, and even the characters themselves are fairly similar between their looks, their personalities somewhat, and their names being Treads of 34. It's because of these parallels and the events that transpired directly after these scenes that I believe Lamb granted Satoko the wish to make her dreams come true with absolute certainty. The reason I say this is because in the original series, Takano had a terrible life until Lamb supposedly granted her the powers of certainty, where things turned around and she was granted all of this power. Satoko was also in a similar really rough spot as Takano was. Takano was at the orphanage, Satoko was at St. Lucia. Both were saved by extreme coincidences that occurred afterwards. Takano found a coin in the phone booth that allowed her to call Professor Takano, and Satoko received a letter to go back to Hinamizawa and met Yua. This right here, I believe, was the missing link. Lamb before presumably Higurashi was undefeated, and Takano presented her first loss. She seems like the type to be a sore loser, so I believe she stuck around and watched this fragment because she became fascinated with Rika for being the first person to beat her, and a non-witch at that too. When Satoko pleaded to the heavens, Lamb got her opportunity to strike and took Satoko in as a pawn. The requirement to become a witch's pawn seems to require the subject to be at an extremely low point in their life. Takano was being hunted after escaping a hellhole. Satoko was risking losing everything in her life to chase Rika. Even Angie, for example, was about to kill herself before becoming Burn's pawn. Satoko allowed the game board to be reopened, and for a new game to start. This is why Satoko is brought into the world of fragments, and Yua refers to herself as a bunch of Lamb references. She's speaking directly to Lamb, the player who dwells in the meta world. We've seen characters do this before, such as Rika Furude and Umineko. It was this scene coupled with Satoko and Takano scenes that I realized Lamb has to already exist to be this involved with the series. So my theory of Satoko being Lamb was basically thrown out the window after the Nekodamashi-hen video. Satoko becoming Lamb's new pawn would explain why Lamb shares traits from both Satoko and Takano, since she was heavily involved with both of them. This new game board sets up a lot of the things we were missing for so long, such as Hanyu's connections to Featherine being finalized. I believe that Hanyu is similar to Rika Furude, where she is a manifestation of Featherine onto the game board. This is why they both have similar traits and similar naming styles, but Hanyu has a backstory and a different voice actor just like Rika Furude did. This would also explain why Burn refers to her as the sounds that Hanyu makes. This is something Hanyu says and does very often, and this is something that Featherine is referred to by Burn. Yua establishes a clear beginning for both Rika and Satoko and Go, but she has set up no middle as the game master and is instead observing. This is on top of the fact that the game board appears to be broken already, with every character involved getting more unhinged as it progresses along. This is setting the seeds perfectly for the logic error needed to create Burn, which supposedly had a start and end but no middle, and a game board that was broken and twisted. The game master for Burn's logic error left the story as is, forcing the player to solve it and leading to Burn's ascension. This is essentially what we're watching here, with Hanyu being Yua, setting up the game board and bringing Rika back, but choosing to interact more and help out Satoko more often. Now let's dive into the third theory I had for Sotsu in the last video that I didn't explain because it was Umineko spoilers. Rika and Satoko stay in the post-Matsuri Bashi fragment. Satoko never dies in that loop, so her going back to the beginning of Matsuri didn't make much sense to me. I'm under the impression that these two versions of themselves are fine and still in Matsuri, while the versions of themselves brought back to 1983 are Lamb and the Rika that will become Burn. Rika has two distinct personalities, one being the sweet and innocent Rika, and the other being the more mature and grown-up Frederica Bernkastel. I probably said that wrong, but who cares? In Higurashi-hen, Rika even refers to there being two parts of herself, which is the base and the one that loops. The one that loops overrides the base Rika whenever she comes into a new fragment. She decided to name herself Frederica Bernkastel because of how different things are in the fragment, to separate that version of herself from the base. Frederica being Furude and Erika combined to make Frederica, and Bernkastel coming from the wine she happened to be drinking in that scene, and also a wine that her father enjoyed quite a lot. So currently, Burn technically already does exist, and with these two world lines existing, it is possible for the pure Rika to finally be normal, with the Burn Rika being separated from the base. That is what I believe happens here when Satoko is brought into the fragment world by Han 2. Han 2 splits Rika and Bernkastel up, putting them into two separate worlds, and separates Satoko and Lambdadelta, but lets Satoko be a vessel for Lamb in the new set fragment. It's here she's tortured by Lamb, and then put through a logic error, where she'll emerge and come out as a witch. Of course, I doubt we'll ever be shown that directly, but it might be implied. What that logic error could be is one of two possibilities. Rika killing Satoko with the Looper Sword, or Rika killing Yua with the Looper Sword. Killing Han 2 would create a logic error, as the game would have no game master anymore, despite it being mid-session, and this would lead for Rika to go through the Sea of Fragments in attempts to find and return Han 2 to the game, this being how Burn searched for her master, Featherine. Killing Satoko with a sword should create a logic error, as it would remove one of the players forcibly from the game and break the game board. Lamb being removed from the board would also explain why she isn't aware how Higurashi ends, but this could also be attributed to the fact that Lamb seems to leave games before they finish, because she thinks she knows what the ending will be. Speaking of, I know that Higurashi is a story in Umi, but technically Umineko is also a story inside of Umineko. They are all events that happen in fragments stored in the Hall of Books. Despite all of that though, I really do not believe that Higurashi Gou and Sotsu will deeply connect with Ciconia or Umineko on the surface, or maybe at all. In fact, I think I might have come to the truth of why Higurashi Gou and Sotsu exist, and it's probably something that a few people watching this video have realized as well. Ryukishi 7 is a genius at marketing. Higurashi no Naku Koro ni is an anime that first came out in 2006, but it kind of flopped over here in the West because it had an absolutely terrible dub. A niche audience did form and a fandom was created for the series, but over the years it really did begin to fade in popularity outside of Japan. This is a screenshot here from my anime list for Higurashi on April 10th of 2019. Its members are at a strong 494,000, but if we take the look at the My Anime List page almost exactly a year after in 2020, its page has only gone up 60,000 members, which is still quite a bit, don't get me wrong, but it isn't much compared to many other series. Out of 12 months, it only managed to gain 5,000 new members per month. That's not very good. Let's take a look at Umineko next. Umineko is going to be a bit harder to calculate, given that Steam doesn't provide copies of the product sold, but I have done some research for games like Dark Souls, CSGO, GTA, and another visual novel like Clannad that usually the conversion rates of players that leave reviews is 7% of the actual player base. This might not be the most accurate statistic, but it will still serve its purpose for what my point is here. May 19th of 2020, Umineko's visual novel was sitting around 470 reviews on Steam, which if we do the math means that there should be around 6,714 copies of Umineko being sold. If we take a look at my anime list around this time, Umineko's first manga volume has 13,000 members. Both of these numbers, again, are not very impressive. Then if we take a look at the most recent product of When They Cry, which is Ciconia, we find out that its reviews lay around 107, meaning that around 1,528 people presumably bought this. All of these sales prices and statistics point to a fandom that was dying, and struggling to stay alive and relevant. 7th expansion was likely struggling and unsure as what to do next, but that is when they came up with the perfect idea of a saving grace. On July 3rd of 2020, a trailer dropped for the first Higurashi animated property released in years. Higurashi When They Cry New, a new and improved remake for a cult classic horror anime. This started spawning a lot of conversation revolving around the series, and was the introduction to the series for a lot of people, myself included actually. I saw this trailer trending on our anime the day it dropped, and I had never heard of Higurashi before. I had seen pictures of both Rena and Rika, but I had never bothered to look at where they were from. And upon hearing this was a horror anime, I grew really curious because I absolutely love horror movies. About a month before the remake was supposed to air, I decided on a whim to watch the original series so I could enjoy the remake even more. And to my surprise, I fell in love with this series. Then October 1st came around, and with it came the first episode of Higurashi's remake. I believe I've talked about it before, about how the first episode appeared to be a more detail-oriented version of the original series, and I was really excited for it. But the second episode changed everything. There was panic and confusion among existing fans, and a lot of confusion among new fans. This is when Ryu himself revealed that Gou was supposed to function as both a remake for new fans and a sequel for old fans. This at first was extremely confusing, but as it went on, I began to see what he meant. He introduced new content that didn't exist before for old fans to solve a new mystery, while also providing all of the old content and some new content like the ending of Matsuri Bayashi for newer fans, while also including stuff from the visual novel that was not previously in the anime's properties. For old fans, the series kept getting crazier and crazier, and it hit a peak with the release of Satokowashi. Suddenly, a character identical to Featherine appears, referencing Umineko, and then that character makes Ciconia references as well, and Satoko begins to act exactly like Lambdadelta. This made people realize that Rika had been acting a lot like Burn in the series, and that was when fandom-wide panic began of Umineko and Higurashi officially being connected. This right here is one of the smartest marketing tactics I have ever seen in my 20 years of life in the form of Higurashi Gou and Sotsu, which is a remake, a sequel, and an enabler. Higurashi Gou gives a lot of content for new viewers, but there is still more they can discover through the 2006 anime. This creates interest and makes new viewers flock to the original series to understand the series more. A character like Featherine appears in Higurashi. This creates discussion for existing fans and makes a ton of people that hadn't read Umineko flock to it to see what that's all about. This Featherine character throws mentions to another creation of Ryuu's called Ciconia. This creates traction and makes a ton of people aware of Ciconia's existence. I had heard about Umineko when Gou started, but I had no idea what Ciconia was until this episode. By sprinkling seeds of connecting points through all of the products, Ryu has created a brilliant loop to make everyone go full circle through the When They Cry products to solve what appears to be a bigger mystery. A person can join the fandom and start off with Higurashi, and then Higurashi makes references to Umineko so they could move on to Umineko. and from there in Higurashi Gou or in Umineko they catch wind of Ciconia and move to Ciconia. Or perhaps they start with Umineko, and Umineko mentions Higurashi, and then they move to Higurashi, and Higurashi references Ciconia, so they move to Ciconia. Ciconia is still pretty early in its phases, but I imagine that it will eventually reference Higurashi or Umineko. So that way people can go from Ciconia to Umineko, or Ciconia to Higurashi, and they continue to loop around endlessly from product to product. And by God does it show in its statistics! Higurashi's My Anime List has increased from 552,000 members to 679,000, which is a 120,000 member increase. This is double what the member count had going from 2019 to 2020, and its numbers continue to rise each day. Umineko's manga has gone from 13,000 members to 20,000 members, and its reviews have doubled from 470 to 890, meaning that the estimated copies sold went from 6,700 to around 12,700. All of this progress for Umineko is barely in over a year. Even Ciconia has doubled, going from 107 reviews to almost 300. This means Ciconia likely went from 1,500 copies sold to 4,200 copies sold. These are just statistics for the West, too. Who knows what they're looking like back in the East? They could be performing even better for all we know. The When They Cry franchise is seeing numbers it hasn't seen in years, maybe even decades, and it's still all just going up constantly. And all of this is possible thanks to Higurashi Gou and to Higurashi Sotsu. Don't get me wrong, I think that Gou and Sotsu exist for reasons besides marketing. For example, to adapt a lot of things that the Deen anime didn't show too much on, or at all, like the curry making competition as a good example, or the mentions of the auction, and most recently in Sotsu it delved more into Rena's family than the original did. It's because of this that the next arc will probably adapt or go more in depth with the Sonozaki twin switching, since the original Deen anime hardly touched on that at all. Gou is also a way for Ryu to give good endings to characters that didn't originally get them. Like Teppei is a big example, Takano is another good one, and even Rena in the most recent episodes of Sotsu is a very good example. Sotsu is likely to conclude Higurashi as well, which conclude is in quotation marks because for all we know it could be left completely open-ended or ambiguous. That's not out of the question. But anyways, it's because of my research that I don't think Higurashi Gou or Sotsu will fully connect to Umineko and Ciconia, because in reality all these connections are all likely just one big marketing scheme. There will likely continue to be more breadcrumbs to connect the two series together, but I don't really ever see it happening. Hantu's existence for many people makes them think that this is the end-all be-all, and that they will 100% confirm everything, but in reality Ryu has done stuff like this before. There's a character that looks almost identical to Tomitake both in Rose Gun Days and Ciconia, and a character that looks almost identical to Ire in this series called Bakemon Hime, and a character that looks like Battler, even named similarly to Battler and Rose Gun's Days, and a character that looks like Shannon in Trianthology. The list goes on and on and on for characters with similar appearances. In some cases, there are identical characters like Okanugi and Amakusa. Hantu might look a lot like Featherine, but in all likelihood, it could just be Ryu using a design of his that he used previously for another character, as this is something he has got quite the history for. The reality of all of this is that When They Cry, and maybe all of Ryu's works, are trapped in a cat box created by Ryu. Ryu has the power to open the cat box to the public, like how Angie could have opened Beatrice's cat box and reveal the one truth. But he won't do it. We are the rest of the world that isn't meant to know the truth. Revealing the truth will ruin the greater mystery at play here, and I don't think that's what Ryu wants. There will always be more and more mentions of the series connecting with one another, but they likely never will truly connect. It will always be ambiguous, and the truth will stay hidden inside the 7th expansion cat box. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons, Vigar and Matt. You guys both rock so much. And I'll see you guys again when Sotsu finishes crying. 頑張れ。